Okay, I think we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining IMAP today for our webinar on the design and distribution obligations for managed accounts. Hopefully, you'll be aware that DDO incepts on the 5th of October this year. Today, we'll be providing some insight into how the industry is preparing and what hurdles we still have to overcome. We're very lucky today to have a great panel of presenters. These include Jessie Vermiglio, partner at Holly Nethercote, an experienced financial services lawyer with over 17 years experience, gained in both private practice and previously with Asic. Michael Potter has joined us from the Financial Services Council. Michael is a Senior Policy Manager at FSC and has been leading the work at FSC on the DDO. We welcome the FSC members to this forum. Greg Illingworth, Head of Strategy and Product Development for the BT Panorama, BT Wrap, and the Asgard products, will be presenting on their progress to date. Finally, Simon Carradis, Director of the Fold Legal. Simon is a specialist financial services lawyer with a real soft spot for wealth management and financial advice. Please join me in welcoming the panel. Next slide, please. Okay, during the webinar, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We'll filter through the questions, and if we have time, we'll answer at the end of the session. Thank you very much. Now, our first presenter, Jessie Vermiglio, is going to take us through on his view of the legislation and how it's going to affect us going forward. Thank you, Jessie, over to you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, IMAP, for the opportunity to contribute to DDO. We've done a bit of work over the course of the journey of DDO and some of the sort of common issues that are arising. And look, safe to say that this is a significant piece of reform, and so it has not been without its challenges. And with most things with law reform, really the devil is in the details. So look, we'll go through a little bit. I just wanted to start off by making some initial observations about the regulatory framework for DDO. Then we'll talk a little bit about the application of DDO to the managed account sector, and then sort of finish up by some tips just to be thinking about, which I'm sure you already are, before you move on to I think Michael, who will walk through some of the presentation and what a TMD looks like. So sort of some starting points or some starting key principles. This is sort of first point that's really important not to forget here, that this is really a new approach to regulation, both by the regulated population, but also the regulator itself. Excuse me. We are moving away from disclosure as a mechanism to regulate and really getting into here product design and the distribution practices. And I think it's really important to not forget that a key policy outcome or key policy driver of this regime is about designing products and distributing them in a way that leads to good consumer outcomes. Or to put it in another way, it's really about extending the current consumer protection framework so that or maybe to rebalance that in a way in which you're looking at designing products and distributing products in a way that that leads to good consumer outcomes. So what does that really mean? Well, it means that product issuers are required to really focus on the design of their products so that they are likely to be consistent with the likely objectives, financial situation and needs of consumers. And also the distribution practices need to align with those as well. So you've got two really key concepts within this regime, sort of on the product design front, and you've also got it on the distribution front. And that's really in the framework of this legislation, the obligations really flow from whether you are a product designer, whether you're a distributor, or whether you're actually operating in both camps. Importantly, the application of this regime applies to financial products, but it's not just the Chapter 7 definition of financial products. It includes the expanded definition of financial products in the financial services regime. And that's given rise to a bit of technical issues about the scope and resulted in the need for some regulations about extending the coverage of this regime to additional products like ODPS. Again, really important that in terms of us understanding where you sit within the regime, whether you're a product issuer or a distributor, is really important because, as I said, it really impacts on your obligations. And one of the most key things to keep in mind here is that this is a regime that inherently is based on an information flow between product designers and your distributors. So to make this work, you do really need open and robust information flows to be able to feed back the information that's necessary to keep this, to comply with your obligations. So next slide, I'm not going to spend too much time on this just because I know that this is probably well known, but I suspect Simon might speak a little bit to these things. Look, you've got design obligations on the left-hand side, distribution obligations on the right-hand side, just in terms of who needs to prepare the target market determination, who needs to review it, how to, what your obligations there are. Key point that I really wanted to make here is, particularly in the distribution side of things, the excluded conduct is really important. So if you are providing personal advice, or if you are providing sort of dealing activity that was associated with personal advice, you are in the camp of excluded activity. What that means is your obligations are different in the sense that what you are required to do is more limited. That said, TMDs are still really important, or at the very least, based on Asic's guidance, are really important as part of the best interest duty obligation. So there's an acceptance by Asic that even though personal advice takes you into excluded conduct, it's still part of the best interest duty journey for advisors. Given that we don't have a lot of time, I won't spend more time, but again, the framework is, as you'll see, on the design side, the need to prepare and review the appropriateness of target market determinations. This is probably a key point for design on the product issuer side. Take reasonable steps that the retail product distribution is in accordance with the TMD. Again, one of the changes in this regime is additional responsibility or new responsibility on product issuers or product designers around the distribution of their products. And this level of responsibility is probably, again, one of the new features of the regime. In the past, if your distribution channel was an AFSL licensed vehicle, then in essence, the distribution was really left to, or the responsibility of that and the liability for that was really left to the distributors. But here now, you have effectively an addition to that and an expansion of that to include also product issuers. And then you've got collection and notification requirements of that information and passing on that information in terms of secondary dealings to Asic. So that's pretty well-known framework that hasn't really changed over the journey of the last couple of years. And as I said before, then you have really the distribution obligations. Importantly, they're the third step, taking reasonable steps to ensure that you're distributing this product consistent with the TMD. Again, collection of information, passing that information on product issuers. So you've probably heard the concept of a feedback loop of information being passed back to product issuers. That becomes really important in terms the development of your frameworks here, and again notifying them of significant dealings. Next slide, thanks. Look, I've just sort of put up a slide in terms of sort of the key players and how this may well apply in terms of the DDO to the various players in the market. You'll see that I'll start with MDA providers. I think there's an open question about the application of the DDO still in relation to MDAs, and I think in the absence of, and that's really based on the structure. There's a broad definition of financial product, as I sort of mentioned before, but also the structures as to how these are provided to clients. I think in the absence of sort of guidance from Asic, which clarifies that, I think it's probably a conservative approach to assume that it does apply. So for the purpose of today, I sort of assumed that for the MDA provider sector, it does apply. And then really it's split out into the sort of three-party model situation. Two-party model is where you've got the MDA provider, both being the product issuer and the distributor, i.e. the advisory channel. And three-party model is where the advisory arm is, or the distribution is external and being provided by an external AFSL provider or AFSL holder. You see there design obligations if you're operating this two-party model where the MDA provider is both the provider and the advisor. And bear in mind the requirement within the class order that the provision of MDAs really is off the back of personal advice. So design obligations do apply for the provider. Design obligations do apply in the three-party model as well. And really the only difference there is really the distribution obligations don't apply to the MDA providers in a three-party model where you have an external advisor. And the next two real elements are really around the SMAs. Design obligations, obviously, as the RE and product issuer. And then really distribution obligations really depends, and it depends on the distribution model that you have in place. So, for example, if there is no client, retail client facing distribution channel, then that won't apply. But if you do, in terms of having direct distribution to retail clients, then the distribution obligations also apply there. Investment managers, from a responsibility point of view, or from a legal responsibility point of view, the design obligations don't apply to them. Investment managers are usually providing their services to the REs. But that said, they're generally going to be involved and heavily involved from a practical point of view in terms of design of those products, and also in assessing the feedback of the information from as part of the distribution channel. In terms of distribution channel, distribution obligations, the investment managers, really there again depends about whether they've got a retail client facing role. So if they're involved in contact with provision of services, contact services for retail clients, then again, that might trigger the obligation for the distribution channel. So knowing what you're doing, what your role is in the provision of the financial product is really, really important to be able to assess, do the distribution obligations apply to me, or do the design obligations apply to me? Finally, advisors, again, I sort of made the point before about excluded conduct. Personal advice takes you into the realm of excluded conduct. Obviously, there's no design obligations for them. They're not product issuers. But if you are really you really need to think about what it is, what your obligations are. Sorry, what it is, what service you're providing in terms of your advice. So if you're providing personal advice, what it does do is it sort of dials down the distribution obligations. But if you're not providing, or if you're providing sort of general advice, you need to think about how that impacts on your distribution obligations. So again, the carve out really relates to personal advice as excluded conduct. So just a couple of tips before we sort of move on to the next speakers. Next slide, please. So as I said, know your role as a product issuer, distributor, or both, because really ultimately that's what triggers your obligations. Advisors, know when you're providing distribution conduct. So in particular, know when you are in excluded territory, excluded conduct territory, or not, because that again will impact on what distribution conduct that you need to, or distribution obligations you need to comply with. Ensure open information flows between product issuers and distributors. I think formalising data standards is really important. I mean, here's an expectation from the regulators about making sure that there's those open and robust information flows. And really, thirdly, as a mechanism to ensure compliance in this space, robust and effective governance practices through really policies, procedures, both on the design phase and in the distribution phase. That's really it for me. We have been working on a suite of policies and procedures to supplement DDO. So if you need any assistance, particularly on policies and procedures, feel free to reach out, and happy to help.
Thanks, Jesse. In the short time, you got a lot covered there, so appreciate your input. As I say, we'll hold questions till the end. We've got Michael Potter coming on next. Michael is going to take us through the target market determination and the TMD template that's been drafted by the FSC working group, and IMAP has specifically provided input to the managed accounts element of that. I just want to add a bit of context here. So when we're looking at this template today, we're looking at it from the point of the actual underlying product. We're not looking at it from a platform perspective. There's still a fair bit of discussion around how industry are going to deal with that scenario where you have products under a PDS sitting under a platform or another administration service. And so whether you'll have one TMD that combines the platform and the product, or one for each. So depending on what the distribution model is, and there's various options that are open to the platform provider and the product issuer. So there's no set guidance at this stage. And so we are just looking at the actual underlying, say, managed account. Now, Michael, I'm just hoping you've got your camera on. Just to kick off, can you sort of talk about what are the key areas of the TMD you're going to run through with us today, and then I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yeah,
that's great. Okay. So for those of you who joined online, you'll now be seeing a copy of the TMD template in front of on your screens now. And I'll talk about how you can get a copy of this later. So as you can see, this is a template of the target market determination. And this is going to be available to FSC members and to people who license it from us or from IMAP. Now, and then it's going to be up to each issuer to determine how they use this. We've provided this template. We've worked through this template with IMAP to make it easier for product issuers to understand their obligations. And also importantly, to the extent that you end up with people using the same template across the industry, you'll end up with a significant amount of standardization, which will make life easier for all types of distributors, particularly advisors. So that standardization is something that Asic has said is beneficial. And when we speak to advisors, those advisors who are aware of DDO, and well, distributors more generally, distributors who are aware of DDO consider that standardization across the industry to the significant extent is going to be beneficial. So Jenny, I might actually dive into it if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, so as I said, you can see it on your screen. So the template starts off with some instructions in italics. As we go through this document, anything that's in italics is just an instruction to a product issuer, and they can read that and they use that as assistance as they're developing their target market determination. So the first substantive part of it is a legal disclaimer. And the reason why we've put this in the template is we think it's useful to make it clear what a TMD is and also what it is not. And in particular, there's a sentence there saying it doesn't replace the PDS. So this document, as we've heard earlier, it's the DDO regime is a different approach. It's not targeted at disclosure. So that it's important to put some text in the document to make it clear how the TMD differs from other types of documents. And also I should mention here and everywhere, it is up to product issuers. You can choose whether to go with the text that's in the template or the approach that's in the template, or go a different approach if you so choose, and you'll need to get your own advice about that. Okay, now we get into the more substantive part of the target market determination. And this first sentence, which I'm highlighting now, is a summary. And what it actually does is it summarizes most of the sections that come below. So I won't go through this sentence. For those who have the template, you'll see that this sentence actually is just a summary of what comes below. Now we'll go into the next section. The next section, there's a table here which just describes the product. So you put in there any particular identifying features of the managed account, and you put in things such as the date the target market determination started. Then we get on to what you might call the more substantive part of actually describing the target market. Now, the way we've done it here is we're using a red, amber, green approach. And as we go through, you will assess the product and see whether a customer who's wanting a particular approach, whether this managed account will be in the target market, potentially in the target market, or outside the target market for that particular characteristic. So I'll go move on and hopefully we'll make it more specific. So let's look at the first one which we've got on the screen now is a consumer's investment objective. And let's say the consumer has an investment objective of capital growth. That's the first row. I'll highlight that now. And you need to ask yourself as a product issuer, is my product suitable for somebody who's wanting capital growth? And if it is, you would rate them as green in this. If it maybe is, then you might put yellow. And if it definitely isn't, then you would put red. And of course, it's up to issuers to determine how they would do this. And I should make it clear, you might be red for more than one, and you might be green for more than one. So there might be products which have got a variety of customers it's suitable for, then you would have a lot of greens. And I'll make it a bit more specific as we go on. So first of all, we've got customer's investment objective. Then we've got intended product use. This is where you're saying the product, is it suitable for being a large part of a portfolio or only a small part of a portfolio? And if you've got something, let's say a very balanced approach, which has got a wide array of investments, you might say it's suitable for all mixes from 0 to 100%. And then what you might do here is you might actually rate the product as being green for all. So it can go anywhere from a satellite to a standalone, and anywhere in between. You might rate the managed account as being green for this measure. Then we've got investment time frame as the next measure. And it's fairly self-explanatory whether the customer is after short, medium or long. Is the managed account suitable for somebody who's wanting short, medium or long investment horizon? Then you've got the risk return profile. And this is, we've sort of actually grouped risk and return together because they're generally linked. So you have low risk and return, medium risk and return, high and very high. And we actually thought for a long time about having them separate, but we thought that would cause some degree of confusion to advisors and or customers. And so we've actually merged them into being this one measure. Oh, and I should also mention, a lot of these things are unpacked in a lot more detail in the definitions, which are at the end of the template, which I won't go through the definitions. I'll just mention them briefly. And the last part of the core section of the target market determination is the issue about how frequently you want to be able to withdraw money. And that's sort of if there are any parts of the managed account which there are restrictions on frequency of withdrawal. Then there's another section here, which is specific to managed accounts, and it looks at the specific characteristics beyond the investment content of the managed account. And things such as individual management of tax inside the investments and the ability to have in-specie transfer in and out of existing investments. And this section here is specific to managed accounts. Then there's, I'll go through the rest of this in a bit faster. There's an appropriateness section. I won't dwell on this. It's just it's a mandatory requirement that Asic has put in its regulatory guide on the DDO. And so we've got some template answer for that one, but I won't go through that now. Then the other parts of the TMD, which are required, are the distribution conditions. So what you would do here is there are several potential rows for distribution conditions. If you had a managed account with no distribution conditions, you'd only use the first row. But if you do have distribution conditions, which I assume is likely, for example, if you're saying your managed account is only available to customers with personal advice, then you would use this you would insert a particular row saying only available to customers with personal advice. And then the other ones, like there might be managed accounts which are only available to customers on a particular platform. You might insert that as another row. We've left this fairly generic because there isn't any sort of one approach which would apply to all managed accounts. Every issuer has to take their own approach on this one. So we've given some guidance on this one, but it's not very specific. Next, we have the review triggers. These are required by law. And I'll say one, for example, which is, for those who don't know about the DDO regime, the target market determinations, you have to state in them when a review of the TMD needs to occur, and it's required for the TMD to state these. So there are several on the screen now. And one of them, which I've highlighted, is you're saying that you will review your TMD if the product intervention powers are used on your product. And another one is that you might have a review trigger if a significant dealing occurs. And we'll get to talk about significant dealing later.
Michael, I was just going to ask a question on that for the listeners. I'm just going back to the wording under those review triggers. Are they mandated or are they suggested?
Yeah, again, as I said at the start, everything in this, you can choose to amend it if you so wish to, or you get advice that you should do so. So the template, there's nothing in this is mandated. I guess you have to follow the law and the ASIC regulatory guidance. This provides assistance to people in meeting those obligations. So everywhere you can amend it if you choose to. However, also, as I mentioned earlier, there are benefits to having a common approach. I guess that's more in the reporting section is going to be the one where it's most important to have a common approach. I'll get to that in just a sec. Next, there is the mandatory review periods. Every TMD needs to have indicated how long it will be between reviews. So it's the period until the first review and then the period until the subsequent reviews. We've just got some suggestions there. Again, it's up to issuers to decide if they keep that or modify it. And here we've got the distributor reporting requirements. Now, this is the one which is particularly going to be important for planners because these reporting requirements are mandated on the advisors. So while advisors have an exemption, as we've heard earlier, as Jessie mentioned earlier, there are exemptions for advisors. They don't have an exemption from the distributor reporting requirements. Mm-hmm. So what we've got here is 3 reporting requirements. So there's complaints, that's the second row. All distributors have to report on complaints within a certain time frame, and we've got that every quarter. The last row is distributors have to report on significant dealings, and we'll come back to what that actually means in a sec. And we've so these complaints and significant dealing reports, they're actually required by law. So that's just sort of broadly complying with the law. There are some specifics in there which are actually not in the law, but the template has given you suggestions of how to approach it. And then there's one more, which is not in the law, which is a requirement to report on each acquisition outside of the target market, and but only if the distributor is aware of that. And that is particularly so that issuers can comply with their own requirements to report on significant dealings.
Michael, can you just confirm who are they reporting to? So who are the distributors, so the advisors on the product, who are they reporting to?
The issuer. So whoever makes the TMD, the reporting occurs from the distributor to the issuer, which is whoever makes the TMD.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, and we can get to it just in a sec about how that will actually occur. Then I'll just quickly go through. There's a section here where you can specify how the reporting goes, and that's actually really important when we talk about data flows and data movement. Then there's a copyright section. And then finally, as I mentioned, there's some definitions. There's some fairly detailed definitions of everything that goes in earlier. And and here's, for example, is a section about how to do high risk return profile, medium risk return profile, low risk return profile for the particular product. And then lastly, in the definitions, there's a section defining significant dealings. And I should make it clear that this is not mandating a definition for distributors. It's a suggestion or a recommendation for distributors about how they may wish to do that, because what we've heard from a number of distributors is that they are unclear about how to do significant dealings. This provides a fair bit of guidance for issuers and distributors about what a significant dealing is. And that sort of brings to a close the discussion of the template. I just might mention a couple of other things. The FSC, we're licensing this, all FSC members can get this template as a matter of course. Non-FSC members, like IMAP members, for example, there will be material provided to you after this about how to license it. And I should point out, FSC, we actually are doing a whole heap of other TMD templates, like there's a funds management one, there's a superannuation one, and there's a platforms one. And the other thing which we've done is we've done some data standards. So as we mentioned, there's a mandatory requirement for product issuers and distributors to communicate with each other. And we've done some data standards, which will hopefully, if they're adopted, enable people to make it easier to have these communication of data between the product issuers and distributors. Okay, I might hand back to you, Jenny, at that point.
Yeah, Michael, I've just, if you could elaborate what's the sort of next stage to getting this template to market for people to start using. So, you know, have you got to sort of talk to the regulator, or is it going back to the working group? Sort of what are we looking at?
The template is sort of near final. We've spoken to Asic about all of our templates at some length. And we're incorporating a few changes, not many, because Asic is sort of not complained significantly about our templates. So I wouldn't say Asic has approved them. I definitely can't say that. Asic has made it very clear they're not approving our templates, but they have provided a fair bit of comment on them. And so this template, this one, plus a whole lot of our other ones are near final. Well, when I say near final, they'll never be locked down forever. It'll be a continual improvement process, but we will consider sort of stopping work on them for quite a while so people have a time to adopt them and put them through in their systems.
Well, good. Thanks, Michael. That's a great overview. And again, we'll sort of push some questions out to the end. And so Michael will be available to answer those as they come through. So the detail on the licensing that's on the screen now will be shared with participants after the webinar, along with the slide packs. Okay. All right, so we're going to hand over to Greg Illingworth today. So as I said, Greg's joining us from BT. So he's going to talk more about how they've approached the design and distribution obligations. You know, we talk about some of the issues that they've had to struggle with and where they've sort of got to. So there's, you know, Greg is not a lawyer, so he's not giving you legal advice, but it's really just about from someone who's sitting there trying to apply this new legislation and the regulations is what is their approach and what are the difficulties that they've had. So please welcome Greg. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon. So my name is Greg Illingworth and I'm the Head of Product Strategy and Product Development for BT's Platforms business. We've been working through the requirements for DDO for quite some time now. And to me, one thing is obvious, which is that you will be affected by it in some way. There's no avoiding that. The legislation, as we've talked about today, is quite complex. And you would have seen that a lot is left to issuers and distributors to make determinations for themselves about how they're going to incorporate those principles into the design of their products, if they're issuing products, and the distribution of those products, whether that's in-house or external. And as mentioned, I'm not a lawyer. These opinions are sort of mine, and you know, talking through how I see things evolving. It's imperative that you seek legal advice. You need to understand what your obligations are going to be, and if you haven't started already, you need to start working on it now. Do not leave it late. You will struggle to be ready, and for issuers, the consequence of not being ready is that your products may not be able to be distributed. So I'm going to talk through about how DDO affects the various participants in our ecosystem, and I'm going to talk about it in quite general terms. And why think about it in this way? Well, for me, it's important to understand the challenges that other participants will face, because ultimately, you know, we all need to work together to deliver value to our mutual customers. Not only that, but in many cases, our obligations are shared, and so we need to cooperate, you know, to efficiently meet them. You know, as Jesse mentioned, you know, two-way information flow is key to success. So with us at BT, we've got over 1,000 products that are going to be required to be captured within this regime. Most of them are externally issued, and we have several thousand advisors on our platforms, all of whom are fully independent of BT. And so the role that we play in terms of intermediating that relationship is pretty key. And you know, the important thing to take from this slide is that the role of the platform is in intermediating those relationships. And so you should expect that the platforms that you work with will be on the front foot in terms of communicating and collaborating, but also being able to provide the compliance tools to help you where that's appropriate. So I'm going to talk through each of these in one by one, and I want to focus on the last one around product issuers. So I'll be going through the others quite quickly. If we go to the next slide. So the major change is the introduction of the TMD for us. And so, you know, as a product issuer, you need to be determining the class of customers that your products are suitable for. You need to document that. You need to make that document publicly available. For platforms products, you know, we'll produce a TMD for the platform product itself, and we will need to have a TMD for each of the each product or investment option that's on the menu, whether that's internally or externally issued. And I'll come back to that later when I talk about issuers. It's important to note that none of this replaces the existing investment governance practices. Those procedures will continue to apply. Another thing you'll need to note is that there will be scenarios that platforms need to plan for around stopping the sale of a particular product, whether that's because the TMD has been withdrawn or because the regulators determined that that product should be withdrawn. You know, it's an unlikely event, but your platforms, their ability to respond to that will depend quite heavily on what systems and capabilities that they have, and whether they can continue to facilitate excluded conduct, which was mentioned earlier, and I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So if we go to the next slide. So DDO affects both, you know, choice super and non-super products. So for the purposes of DDO, the major distinction for platforms that we need to make is between advised and non-advised clients. And the reason for that is because of, you know, the reasonable steps obligations, and that those obligations don't apply where personal financial advice is being provided. And so platforms are free to implement that advice as part of that carve-out. And that's a really important distinction for us because we have non-advised clients as well, whether that be previously advised or direct clients. where we do have those reasonable steps obligations. And so for us, we need to be able to differentiate between the two, and we need to be able to facilitate solutions that would let you continue to distribute products to each of those cohorts independently of each other. I'll talk a little bit about why the excluded conduct is there, and you know, this is in recognition that there's a much higher bar already in place for advisors around best interest duties and so on. And so, you know, really thinking about what the DDO is trying to achieve and who it applies to, you've got this legislation applies to much more than just platforms and investment services. So you've got things like tire and room insurance involved, you know, funeral insurance, and potentially those areas where you've got less governance and less maturity around the risk processes. And so whilst, you know, this might be raising the bar for those organizations or those product manufacturers or distributors, for advisors in some ways is a lower bar than what's existing there today. And so the regulators made a pretty good decision to exclude that conduct and let advisors continue to operate under their existing duties. One thing to note is that explicitly called out in the ledgers around choice architecture in the platform product design. So you know, for us, that's really important for the non-advised sector segments where we would be the distributor, and making sure that, you know, because we're doing that fully digitally, that the product design is tailored in such a way that you know, the products that are surfaced to customers are the ones that are most likely to be consistent with their likely objectives, their situation and their needs. On the next slide. So what if you're an advisor, what do you really need to do? Well, for me, you need to understand the TMD, that's for sure. And you need to adapt your processes to include reviewing that TMD. Even if you're providing personal financial advice and so you've got, you know, excluded from the reasonable steps obligations, you still need to understand what's in that document because you have those reporting obligations. And so you need to be able to report on your some of those items that the issuer's asked you to, which could include distribution outside of target market. And you'll need to understand what that target market determination is and be able to demonstrate and evidence the process that you've gone through to be able to determine whether that distribution, whether that event is outside of target market or not. It's really important to that end that you keep your record keeping up to scratch, particularly where you are relying on that excluded conduct provision. You know, in addition to it being one of your obligations, you're likely to get asked by the regulator or asked by a platform as part of them discharging their obligations and their controls for evidence in support of that excluded conduct. And I think from my end as a product developer, to me, because of that intermediary role that we play, it's really important that we actually provide the right tools to be able to capture and consolidate and remit some of that data between the advisor and the issuer. So, you know, if each advisor or business had to do that for themselves, it's an incredibly cumbersome exercise of being able to identify the issuer, identify how you're going to pass that data back, and go through all of that process and the mechanics of that, the actual administration of it yourself. So for me, you know, platforms sit in the middle of those relationships, and we're certainly going to be producing, you know, tools to help you with that. You know, we're going to continue to uplift and mature those tools over time as we get into October and next year. If we go to the next slide around issuers. So, you know, this is where I think, you know, most people will be interested about it. The major activity now is to produce and make available your target market determination. But you have to keep in mind your downstream activities that you need to set up for. You'll need to have an operating model and resourcing to collect and analyze the data that you're going to receive back from distributors. You're going to potentially have to have systems in order to incorporate that information. And you're going to have to set up to do something with that information. You need to have trigger processes and periodic reviews, and there's a lot of work off the back of that information. If your product lifecycle is already mature, then, you know, this shouldn't be too much of a problem for you, shouldn't be too much of a change. But if you're starting from a low base, then you'll likely have a lot more to do. And so you really do need to be thinking about that now. The other things to note is because you are operating in this ecosystem, you've got to be aware of the complexity that you put into your distribution conditions and the complexity that you put into your data requirements. If it's overly complex or overly niche, or overly prescriptive, distributors may not be able to comply with that. So, engaging with your platforms, engaging with other distributors to understand what's feasible for them will, help you make a proper determination about what data you need in order to operate your product effectively. So, yeah, be prepared early. Expect an increase in engagement from us. We're from a BT perspective. We're going out over the next month, probably the next couple of weeks. We'll have some better comms on that around our timelines. But we intend to receive our TMDs in tranches. I think the first tranche is due 30th of June for those that are very early. But we've got, as I said, over 1,000 products that we need to review the TMD for and be able to facilitate distribution of. So the earlier the better. And collaborating to make that work ahead of October is going to be really important. If we don't receive a TMD, or if we receive that late, we may not be able to distribute that product. So it's important that you do that, quickly or in a timely way. And that's it from me.
Thanks very much, Greg. I think you gave everyone a great insight into the struggles that you've had trying to decipher everything that's coming through, and definitely have given the advisors a bit of a nudge in the right direction as to what to expect. So I think now we're just finally wrapping up with Simon Carradus from the Fold Legal. So he's going to give us an overview of what he sees as coming next. So, what are the key dates that you need to think about, and what do you have to do to make sure that you're going to be compliant in time? So I'll hand over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I apologise, everyone. It probably feels a bit like you're drinking out of the fire hose. There's a lot of information to get through, as you've gathered. It is complex legislation. It's not user-friendly, and we all have to sort of work together to try and get our heads around it. And apply it in a way that works for businesses and for customers. What I want to try to do is because a lot of this stuff's already been mentioned earlier, but I want to sort of try and put it in simple language if I possibly can, and fast forward to the 5th of October, and imagine that if you're a issuer, you've got your target market determination, you've got that finalised, signed off, it's publicly available. Or if you're a distributor, the products that you distribute, they've got their TMDs out there. And so what next? Is it, great, that's done, set and forget, fantastic? Unfortunately not. The legislators rarely make it that simple for us. There are ongoing obligations as well. The TMD is a huge piece of work, but it's a bit like your car. It requires sort of regular maintenance, both on the part of the issuers who issue the TMD and the distributors as well. So I just want to walk you through, post 5 October, we're in the post DDO world, if you will, and what are the ongoing obligations both for issuers and for distributors. So I'll start with issuers. And remember, in the context of managed accounts, we're really talking about MDA providers. So if we're talking about an MDA structure, then the issuer will be the MDA provider. If we're talking about an SMA structure, then the issuer will be the responsible entity for that SMA. So they're the issuers. And what are they required to do on an ongoing basis? Well, firstly, issuers have to take reasonable steps that are reasonably likely to result in distribution being consistent with that TMD. So that's a how long is a piece of string type question. Of course, we'll go through some other requirements which essentially feed into that and will help an issuer maximise the likelihood of distribution being consistent with the target market determination. But specifically, issuers do not fail. There's not an automatic fail of that obligation just because a consumer or a handful of consumers outside the target market do acquire the product. It's not like that. If the issuer does take reasonable steps, but for whatever reason the distribution is still inconsistent, that doesn't automatically mean that the issuer has breached. It's all about the steps they've taken. If they're reasonable, the issuer has complied. So there's no obligation to sort of be, standing over the top of every single advisor or distributor that distributes your product. The second obligation is, ongoing obligation I should say, is to review the target market determination. Again, it's not set and forget. And there are two main reasons why you would be required to review your target market determination. The first one is essentially what we mentioned before, a review trigger. And essentially, if a review trigger occurs, the issuer must review their TMD within 10 business days. The review triggers, which you'll sort of specify yourself, it's up to the issuer to determine what they think they'll be. But they're essentially supposed to be events that would reasonably suggest, our TMD is no longer appropriate, we need to fix it. And the idea is that they're designed to stop distribution of the product, either directly or via distributors, until the TMD is reviewed and updated. But aside from review triggers, there's also a requirement to carry out periodic reviews, regular reviews. Again, that will be up to the issuer, but the guidance is that they should generally be shorter for complex or high risk products. So it might be sort of 3 months or 6 months instead of 1 or 2 years. And also shorter if the issuer is new to issuing that type of product, type of product that the issuer has not issued before. Therefore, okay, maybe we should review our TMD a bit earlier, a bit more often, until we get an idea of whether it's fit for purpose. Issuers are, of course, and this comes back to how does an issuer help themselves to determine that distribution is broadly in accordance with the TMD? Oh, they have to communicate with their distributors. So they are required to collect certain information from their distributors, and they have to specify what information that they want to collect regularly, and they put that into their TMD. And specifically as a part of that, it's basically designed to be information that can help them determine when their TMD may no longer be appropriate. And specifically, one part of that, a big part of that is the collection of complaints from distributors. Not only whether there's been a complaint, but the number of complaints about the specific product, which that information, obviously you can understand how that would help an issuer determine whether or not their TMD is appropriate or not, or needs to be reviewed. Issuers also need to notify Asic of significant dealings in the product that is inconsistent with the TMD. So they have to do that within 10 business days if they become aware of a significant dealing outside the TMD. Now, what's a significant dealing? Well, helpfully, it's not defined. A bit like significance in the context of breach reports, it's not actually defined, but there's a bunch of factors. They give you a bunch of factors that issuers can use to try and determine whether or not a dealing is significant. And those factors include, the proportion of customers who have invested in the product, purchased the product that are not in the target market. So how many have gone outside the target market? Noting that there will be some who'll go outside because of personal advice, which we'll come to in a second. The actual potential harm to consumers is another factor, and also the nature or the extent of the inconsistency with the TMD. Is it dramatic or is it minor, whatever it may be. So those significant dealings need to be reported to Asic. And finally, issuers need to keep their own records, and those are records in relation to their decisions made in relation to their TMD over time, so the iterations of their TMD, including the reviews, the trigger reviews and the regular reviews. And they also have to keep records of the reasons for those decisions. Why did we do this? Why did we make that change? And if the issuer is also a distributor, so in the case of a lot of MDA providers are also distributors because they provide the advice on their own MDA, then they also have to keep records of the distribution information as well, which is required of distributors, so complaints and so on and so forth. And they have to keep those records for up to 7 years because Asic can request that information. They can go in and say, well, show us your history of your TMD and why you made these decisions and what changes you made. So Asic can request that. So issuers have to keep that information for up to 7 years. On to distributors now. Now, it's important to note that when it comes to managed accounts are generally distributed pursuant to personal advice, right? But for MDAs, that's a strict legal requirement. MDAs can only be distributed pursuant to personal advice. For SMAs, it's not a strict legal requirement, but they are overwhelmingly distributed pursuant to personal advice. So in the context of managed accounts, I see that the word distributors really means financial advisors. We mentioned earlier that personal advice falls under the definition of excluded conduct in the legislation. Accordingly, there are certain DDO obligations that do not apply when personal advice is provided. In particular, there's no need for a financial advisor to check that a target market determination has even been made for a product, and there is no need for a financial advisor to take reasonable steps to ensure the product is distributed in accordance with the TMD. That sounds really good, doesn't it? But unfortunately, this legislation, it gives with one hand and takes away with the other. Whilst those are strictly correct, no need to check that a TMD has been made, no need to take reasonable steps. Separately, ASIC comes along and says, the legislation says on the other hand, but you, in executing your best interest duty obligation, you should refer to the TMD. And also you still have to report significant dealings that are outside of the TMD. So really, even though you're not required to check that it exists or take reasonable steps, you still actually have to review it and essentially take reasonable steps and note when a distribution occurs outside of the TMD. So it's a bit of a false dawn, unfortunately, in terms of the definition of excluded conduct. It doesn't help greatly. But the remaining obligations that advisors, financial advisors on managed accounts do have is, as I said, significant dealings, notify the issuer. If that's not notifying ASIC, the distributors are usually communicating with the distributors are communicating with the issuers, and the issuers are generally communicating with ASIC. So a distributor must notify the issuer of a significant dealing in a product that is outside the TMD within 10 business days of becoming aware of their significant dealing. They also need to provide information about complaints. We mentioned that earlier. It's a two-way street. Distributor receives a complaint about a particular product. It doesn't need to be done within a certain period of time. That'll be specified in the TMD. So it might be you can provide it quarterly. Any complaints? No. Any complaints? Yeah, we had 3. So it has to specify the number of complaints as well about a product, which is obviously very, very useful information for the product issuer. And finally, again, distributors have to keep records of their distribution information, including the complaints they've received in relation to the products that they distribute. And again, that's a 7-year record keeping obligation. All right, that's all from me, Jenny. I'll throw back to you.
Hello, I think I'm back on screen. All right, well, we've had a massive influx of questions and we're just a few minutes to spare. So I think some of them Simon has already answered through on that. So I think that was good, but I've just got a couple here. Some of them are a bit, sorry, I did have them, but they've been, Simon, you've answered most of them. About storage, we've had those questions. Okay, so there's one question here to understand about if the product provider provides the PDS, do they have the TMD as well? So I think that's a question probably for Simon, maybe.
So what was the question?
So the question here was about understanding the product provider provides the PDS. So how does the TMD work with the PDS?
Michael, my understanding would be that in most cases the TMD would go either in or along with the PDS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, so the legislation requires the TMD to be publicly available, but it doesn't require anybody to receive the TMD. For practical purposes, issuers really should send their TMDs to all distributors of the product. It won't work. The process won't work at all unless you send it to distributors. So the people you really should be sending it to is the distributors, which means advisors. You need to send it to the advisors. You don't have to send customers anything. A customer can get it if they ask for it, and you might want to put it on your website and have it available, but you do not have to give it to the customers. So that's a bit different from a PDS.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael.
From a platform's perspective, we will make available both. So we'll be asking for the TMD as part of the distribution obligation for us, and we'll be having that on the website right next to the PDS. So you'll be able to download the PDS and the TMD from your platform, and I'd expect that other platforms should be doing that as well. Mm-hmm. I think there were a few questions around, is the person that's producing the PDS also responsible for producing the TMD? And the answer to that one is yes. Yeah. And in the cases where you've got SMAs where you might be advisor, you might be the manager for that, but it's actually issued by somebody else, that person that is issuing it, they're responsible for the TMD. So in the case of BT, where we've got managed portfolios that are issued by us, but we've got external managers, we will be responsible for issuing that TMD and maintaining that TMD.
I was going to do this one quick question here, just to make it clear, with people who only deal with wholesale clients and wholesale products, do the DDO apply? So this is, unless the lawyers want to correct me, this is a retail product requirement, not a wholesale product requirement.
Yeah. Although if there is somebody retail anywhere in that process, you do need to do a TMD. So you might say there was a question about you distribute wholesale only and through advisors. If you're distributing retail through advisors, you still have to do a TMD, even if everybody else is wholesale.
Understood. I think, what was the other one? So TMD at a scheme level or a model level, and I think, again, Greg has probably dealt with this the most in his analysis of the legislation. So do you see that there would be a TMD for each individual model or investment option within a scheme, or just at the scheme level?
Look, that is a really, really good question. We're still working through our approach for that example. We have a scenario, we've got one scheme, 30 PDSs and about 140 different options. We're trying to understand with our legal team exactly what our obligation is and where it lies, because thinking about the spirit of the legislation, you're trying to define a class of customers for whom those products are appropriate. And it probably is too far to the left if you say it's one TMD, and it's probably too far to the right if you say it's 140 for each investment option. And so we're trying to figure out what the right middle ground is for that, to be both compliant but also sensible from just an administration point of view and a practical point of view, and actually for participants to be able to understand the products to which the TMD applies.
Right. We've got one other question, and this is probably Jesse, maybe. Just with where you have to report, say, significant dealings or a complaint or any other impact from the TMD, would that be the AFSL of the distributor reporting, or would an individual advisor have to report that?
It's a good question. I think it's based on the distributor, and the distributor could be either a licensee or it could be an authorised representative. So off the top of my head, I'd say that obligation would apply to the distributor, which could be both.
Okay, and I would suggest that they need to discuss with their licensee to understand what those obligations are at a licensee level. I think we're at time, so
sorry, can I just mention that you would expect that the licensees would probably consider doing that as part of the service they provide to the advisors they license.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Okay. So thanks very much, everyone. So we've managed to get through an awful lot of material in a short time. I just want to highlight that IMAP subscribers do have access to the TMD. It is licensed through FSC, but IMAP have negotiated a special price if you're an IMAP subscriber. So, and the link to apply for that will be sent out after this. So thanks very much to all of our panelists. It's great information. I'm sure everyone got something out of that. Questions will be answered afterwards. We'll do a Q&A and send that out as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.